Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Microphone's working? Perfect. My name is Dr. James Herrera Brooks, and I serve as the Melanie Trent DeShutter Senior Director for Research and Publications here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I'm still getting used to all of those syllables, so thank you for your patience. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome you to this very special Women's History Month lecture in our Scholar Series. Women's History Month encourages us to recognize and celebrate the tremendous contributions that women have made to American society and to our shared history more broadly. And just in a moment, I'll be very excited to welcome our speaker, who herself is an impactful storyteller whose masterful work has highlighted previously little-known stories of women's vital work throughout our history. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge the generous support of Comrade Mercer Hall, who has endowed the VMHC's Scholar Series. Comrade serves as an honorary vice chair of our Board of Trustees and has been a champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles F. Bryan, whom this series also honors. Before we begin today with tonight's program, I just want to let you know that at noon, on April 10th, we will welcome Charles Trueheart to discuss his new book, and you may have just seen the advertisement for it up here on the screen. Rooted in his experiences as a child in Saigon, Charlie will tell the story of two Virginia diplomats, Bill Trueheart and Fritz Nolting, who led the U.S. diplomatic mission in South Vietnam in the early 1960s. And now, as we move on to tonight's program, I just want you all to take a moment to make sure any devices that you might have are switched to silent, off, or do not disturb. And with that, we can make a start. In the collective consciousness of the United States, Pat Nixon has long been perceived as enigmatic. Voted the most admired woman in the world in 1972, Pat was a highly traveled First Lady, visiting 83 countries during her tenure. Domestically, Pat developed past preservation efforts in the White House. She was a progressive on women's issues and a pro-choice supporter on women's reproductive rights, even before Roe versus Wade in 1973. The real Pat Nixon, however, bore little resemblance to the woman so often described as elusive and mysterious in the press. So here tonight to speak to us about the essential nature of First Lady Nixon is Heath Hardage Lee. Heath is the author of 3 books, the second of which, titled The League of Wives, The Untold Story of the Women Who Took on the US Government to Bring Their Husbands Home, is currently being developed into a television series. Heath and her work has been featured on The Today Show, C-SPAN, and the Smithsonian Channel's America's Hidden Stories series. She is also a prolific history and political writer for publications like Time, The Hill, and The Atlantic. Her other books include Winnie Davis, Daughter of the Lost Cause, and of course, most recently, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady, which forms the basis of tonight's talk. So please join me in welcoming back Heath Lee.
Thank you so much, James, for that nice introduction. And I want to welcome some of my guests. I have some family members who've been forced to be here again, and want to give a special shout out to my nephew, Owen Engel, who is a political genius who I feel will be president someday. So just a little shout out. We are going to start with a very short video. It's about 30 minutes that I wrote and directed just to give you the context of Pat Nixon before we start in on her story. So here we go with that. Hopefully this will work. Let's see. Do not see video. Whoops. Let me go back. Tech help, AI help out there. Is there anyone who can help with the video? So sorry about that. We'll get started in just a minute. It does not seem to be coming up. Worked in practice fine. I know, it did work fine in practice. No worries. I'm not sure. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. That's why he makes the big bucks here.
Our society was not of one mind. Women were mostly back then homemakers, secretaries.
Women's wear daily is referred to as plastic Pat. Now, what's that kind of thing?
That was not who she was.
I enjoy what I do tremendously. I look over here speaking very carefully and think maybe I shouldn't be.
This political discussions, she doesn't say much, but you can always go to the heart of her. She's got an enormously good intuition. She probably is one of the most intelligent women ever to been first lady. She has been in the top 10 of most admired women for years after we even left Washington.
What do you think people need to know about Pat Nixon that they do not?
She was a trailblazer. They couldn't stop talking about how good she was as a diplomat for the U.S.
Hand of diplomacy.
Hand of diplomacy, and that was Pat Nixon.
I want to just talk about Mrs. Nixon's push to get a woman on the Supreme Court.
Pat Nixon was forthright about her desire for a woman on the court.
She was publicly pro-ERA, pro the Equal Rights Amendment, pro-choice before Roe versus Wade.
Pat Nixon's biggest legacy to me is what she did to advance women. Advancing women at that point in our history, in the early 1970s, is the major legacy of Pat Nixon. What a great example she was for a first lady.
All right. So that gives you a little bit of context for what we're going to talk about tonight. And that beautiful lady in the blue suit is my good friend, Barbara Hackman Franklin. She was Secretary of Commerce under President Bush. But before that, in 1971, she worked for President Nixon, getting women into higher levels of government. And I'll talk a little bit about her later in the presentation. But the first thing I want to start with is the cover, which a lot of people have found surprising. The title, which is a little bit different, intended, of course, to draw you in to the mysterious Mrs. Nixon. Well, why did I choose that title? Mrs. Nixon was seen by many, particularly in the media, as enigmatic, Sphinx-like. One writer called her America's political Greta Garbo, which, you know, is not true at all. And I will tell you about that some more. You may have also heard Plastic Pat. You might have even heard rumors that she was a heavy drinker and reclusive during the Watergate scandal. Well, I have spent 4 years working on this, digging into it, interviewing everyone possible within the family, outside the family, people who worked for the Nixons, people who were on the outside, as well as media figures. And I'm here to tell you that none of that is true or accurate about the real Mrs. Nixon. And that's what I'm hoping to elucidate for you a little bit this evening. Now, to understand Pat Nixon, I think indeed to understand anyone, it is so important to go back to where they are born. As Richmonders, I'm sure we can all appreciate that. As Virginians, we all think we are royalty, of course. So out west in the 1930s, as she is coming of age, and before that, it's a bit of a different ethos. So she is born in 1912 in Ely, Nevada, which is this tiny little town. And even today, it has not changed much. It's very forbidding kind of desert landscape with scrub pines. And there's a road that winds around that people have called the loneliest road in America. It's very desolate. But she was born there on March 16th of 1912 in a tiny mining shack. Her father, Will Ryan, was a miner, and her mother, Kate, was a recent German immigrant. Kate hated and feared mining. Her first husband had died in a mining accident, and then she had married Pat's father, Will Ryan. So because Kate hated mining so much, they soon moved to Artesia, California, which is now known as Cerritos, California, when Pat was about 2 years old. So the family moved with Pat, her two brothers, Tom and Bill, and Will bought a small ranch in Artesia and became known as the Cabbage King. The family was quite poor, and they all had to work hard to make ends meet. So they're really there in kind of frontier days. This is in Pat's DNA, Pat Ryan's DNA. And everyone has to work together, male and female, both halves of the couple, to make this work. So it's a bit of a frontier upbringing. By the time Pat Ryan is 17, she and her brothers are orphaned. Her mother, Kate, dies of Bright's disease when Pat is just 13 years old. You can imagine for any teenage girl how devastating that would be. And then her father, Will, dies when she is 17 of silicosis from the mines. So Pat not only has to raise herself, she has to help raise these two brothers. And due to the way women's role was at the time, and indeed, I think even now this is often true, all the housework, the cooking, the cleaning, the ironing, this all falls to Pat. So she does that. She works multiple jobs to put her brothers through college. And then she does something very unusual for women of that time. She goes to college. The brothers then help put Pat through college, and she earns the equivalent of a master's degree, the first lady to earn a master's degree. This is remarkable for that time period, for somebody from that background to have that kind of drive and ambition to do that, to pull herself up by her bootstraps. Now, when I did a series of wonderful interviews with David Eisenhower, David Ike's grandson, President Eisenhower's grandson, marries later on Julie Nixon. So she's now Julie Eisenhower. And David is a professor, very, very smart and very objective person. I did some great interviews with him for the book. And this is what he told me about his mother-in-law that really made me look at her Western roots as key to understanding her. He said, his quote, which I love, he says, Pat Ryan came from an Annie Oakley background. Her spirit is Western and California. She's not someone who's molded by the image makers. And there's a real resistance to hierarchy in her character that you're going to see later on in the story in the second administration with Pat Nixon. And this really does come from her kind of Wild West background. So we'll move quickly along the timeline since I don't have you for 10 hours to tell you all the details. And my family knows I have told them more than they ever want to know about the Nixon family, but I promise I will not do that to you. We will end on time promptly. But to go back a little bit and tell you about the Nixons and the marriage. So Pat moves to Whittier, California in the late 30s. She becomes a teacher at Whittier High School. She teaches economics and business, is beloved by her students. This is after she's put herself through school. She's worked for Bullock's Wilshire, the fancy department store, as a model. She also worked in Hollywood, by the way, as a bit player in movies you might have heard of, like Ben-Hur. She was in Ben-Hur. She was in Becky Sharp, and decided that the movie life was not for her. For various reasons, she found it really boring. And she said girls were tempted to take presents from, movie executives. Oh, how things don't change. So she skips that movie biz and moves on to teach in Whittier. She meets Richard Nixon, who is a tall, dark, handsome lawyer, the catch of the town, at a play. They both are interested in community theater. It's a play called The Dark Tower. He's immediately smitten with her. The night he meets her, he says, "I'm going to marry you." And then, of course, Pat thinks he's completely nuts and kind of, puts him off for a while. She even makes him drive her to dates with other men for a period of time. Props to Pat. She is amazing. And he keeps coming back for more. He's just totally smitten. And over time, she too becomes smitten. They marry in 1940. And then Richard Nixon becomes this meteoric rise in politics. He is elected in 1946 to the House of Representatives, in 1950 to the Senate, to the US Senate. And by 1952, he is with General Ike Eisenhower, the god of all army gods, as Julie Nixon Eisenhower told me. Of course, he, saves us all in World War II. So Dick Nixon from Whittier, California, and his wife, Pat, find themselves here with Ike and Mamie, soon to become the president and first lady. Dick Nixon is his running mate, his vice presidential running mate. And I won't tell you here tonight about the Checkers speech. You may have heard of the famous Checkers speech, but let it suffice to say they all had a very rocky start together. And Pat was very wary of the Eisenhowers and Mamie at first. But between the two women, quickly forms a very warm, supportive relationship. They become good friends, and they work very well together for 8 years as first lady, and Pat is second lady from 1953 to 1961. Now, there's quite a marked difference between the two first ladies. And to be fair, there's sort of a continuum of first ladies and the development of that role that I've studied quite a bit for this book. So with some notable exceptions like Eleanor Roosevelt, first ladies in the 50s, when Mamie was first lady, or think of Bess Truman too, they really were mostly kind of ceremonial figureheads. Mamie did not use her position as a platform on issues like we see now. She did not have a signature project. That whole signature project thing starts with Jackie Kennedy and her work on the White House. Mamie rarely travels with President Eisenhower. She only goes to the Oval Office 2 times during the entire 8 years. What she really loves to do is sleep until noon every day. And her esthetician told her if she wrapped herself up like a mummy with creams, she would not get a wrinkle. So I would like to try that. I think my sister and I would both really enjoy that. But a lot of us don't have time for that. And Pat definitely did not have time for that. She was really more of a working first lady. Oh, and I forgot to tell you about Mamie. For staff meetings, she would not let them start staff meeting until the staff watched As the World Turns, the soap opera, with her. So that's Mamie. And then you have Pat. So let's think about what she did to put herself through school, to put her brothers through school. She was always just working all the time. And she carries this into her work as second lady and then later as first lady. She travels all over the world as second lady and later as first lady, both with and without her husband on numerous diplomatic missions. And then when she becomes first lady, she has numerous first lady projects, never just one signature project. She says, people are my project. She's also a staunch campaigner for her husband in all his races, and they are known together as the Pat and Dick team. They really come as a package, and they work that way for a very long time. So Pat Nixon becomes a working first lady, and she is one of the first modern ones, I'd say, along with Lady Bird. Jackie's kind of borderline, and then Lady Bird on, it becomes a little bit more of a modern office. So again, moving along in time, we'll talk more specifically now about Pat's time as First Lady from 1969 to 1974. She has so many important contributions as First Lady. You can read about all of them in the book. Since we don't have tons of time tonight, I'm going to really focus on what I think are her two most impactful legacies as First Lady. And the first one is her experience as a global diplomat. President Eisenhower was really perhaps the first, along with her husband, to realize her talent in this area. I call him in the book kind of a talent spotter, that he sees that Pat Nixon is authentic, she's warm, she's really interested in travel in global cultures other than her own. And this is really different. You know, first ladies before then, they were not traveling with their husbands. They were certainly not going across the world, with a few exceptions like Eleanor Roosevelt. This was not the norm. So Mrs. Nixon is very groundbreaking in that way. President Eisenhower always told his vice president, quote, take Pat on all his diplomatic forays. And this training really serves Pat Nixon well as First Lady, because very soon after she becomes First Lady, this is in May of 1970, the Great Peruvian Earthquake strikes. Now, this is also the time when, this will sound a little strange, but global disasters first started being televised during the early 70s. Before then, we were, somewhat disconnected from the rest of the world in terms of a media perspective. It would take time for newspaper dispatches to get back, or telegrams. But now television has been around a while, and the technology is allowing us to have reporters on the ground when there are global disasters. Now, of course, we have a deluge of this. Every 5 minutes, we're seeing the California fires, or an earthquake, or a terrible plane crash in Lima. But here, this is one of the first globally televised disasters. So Pat Nixon sees this on television, and herself, with no prompting from staff or her husband, says, I must do something. I've got to do something. 70,000 Peruvians were killed in this earthquake, 50,000 were injured, and 100,000 were left homeless. So again, Mrs. Nixon feels like she must do something. She takes off by herself with her staff, of course, but without the president, to Peru. And she goes as his global solo ambassador. And this is the first time a first lady has had that official role as solo global ambassador. Sometimes she's called goodwill ambassador, but it's more than just goodwill, because she brings money, she brings clothing, medical supplies, relief funds to a devastated country. Her example is seen all over the world, and it leads other countries, even Russia, to come to the rescue and send the Peruvians more aid, following this lead. And I have to give her props for wearing an aqua blue suit and Ferragamo heels in the earthquake rubble. I mean, look at that. That's just totally amazing. So, it doesn't look easy. I kind of want her to wear boots, but anyway, that's what she wore. setting a wonderful example, dignified example for other nations to follow. In 1971, Mrs. Nixon was awarded Peru's Grand Cross of the Order of the Sun. This is the highest honor Peru has to give. And I have seen multiple times, I've had people tell me this, even a student from Peru, when I spoke at Stanford, told me it was in all the Peruvian history books. This amazing thing she does that's not in American history books, but in Peru, they all know about Mrs. Nixon and what she did. And this did more to improve Peruvian relations between our country and Peru, of course, than anything else before or probably since then. Africa. This is one of my favorite pictures of Mrs. Nixon. I mean, this is kind of the essence of Mrs. Nixon and her embrace of global cultures. Here, she is in Africa in January of 1972, again, acting. Her husband is like, honey, you've got this, go do it. She goes to Africa as his global solo ambassador. And this is the first time a first lady has gone to Africa, but it isn't Pat's first time in Africa. She has been in Ghana in 1956 when Ghana celebrated their independence. She attended that celebration with her husband and met Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King there. So she's already been to Africa, which in the 50s, this is really different and unheard of. And she makes it a point to come back. She is also the first lady to speak to a foreign parliament in Ghana. And again, just the way she embraces these women here, they wrap her up in this traditional blue lapa cloth. She dances with them. She's just fully engaged in a very warm and authentic way. And this really wins hearts and minds in a way that policy and paper really can't do. Now, soon after Africa, she does not get much rest. Next, she goes this time with her husband to China. And this might be her trip that some people might actually know about this trip. This is probably one of her most famous diplomatic coups, occurs on this 1972, February 72 trip to China. Now, the point of this trip, President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, had been working for a matter of, I believe it was almost 2 years, through back channels, through secret diplomacy, and finally out in the open to reopen up relations between China and the West after many decades of estrangement. And they actually managed to do this. This opening of China is one of President Nixon's, it will be one of his sort of signature achievements. But Nixon and Kissinger are locked behind closed doors the whole time, negotiating with the Chinese. So Mrs. Nixon is the face of the Nixon administration. Remember, we're in the age of global television. So the camera follows Pat Nixon everywhere in her bright red coat, which I bet some people in this room might remember that coat. And again, first ladies and what they wear, we're always watching this. There's a lot of diplomacy, a lot of coded signals. This one is no big secret. Red is the color of good fortune in China, good luck. So indeed, it brings good luck to the trip. And people love her. They watch her watching the pandas at their zoo. She goes to an acupuncture clinic. She visits the Great Wall of China. She buys pajamas for her husband. So she does all kinds of things. And then what is the most exciting is one night she's having dinner with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, with her husband, with the premier's wife. And they are looking, there's a painted tin, a cylindrical kind of tin painted with pandas on it. Now, Pat was a secret smoker. She actually smoked a lot, never in public. She would never be caught dead smoking in public. But the premier offers her a cigarette and she declines, but she says, "Oh, pandas, they're so cute. I love them." And he says, "I'll give you a pair." And he doesn't mean panda cigarettes. He means real pandas. So she is like, "Oh my gosh, yes, I would love a pair of pandas." So he gives her this pair of pandas. And many generations of children will go to the Washington National Zoo to see these two famous pandas. And she shows up at the dedication at the National Zoo and gives a really cute speech you can watch on YouTube. And she declares it is pandemonium at the zoo. So there's that. And then there's a side story about President Nixon worried that the pandas were not reproducing and what could they do. Go on YouTube and look for that. That might be too R-rated to talk about tonight. So there's that, which we know now as panda diplomacy. This summer in San Diego, we finally got another pair. You know, the Chinese have withheld the pandas because they were angry with us. I guess it's a little better now. It's a little dicey, but it's getting better when you see the pandas. So the National Zoo also recently got another pair. So the panda diplomacy is a barometer of our relations with China, and it waxes and wanes. But we can thank Pat Nixon for that, her soft diplomacy for giving us that. And then soon after this trip, she goes on to Soviet Russia, where the president and Kissinger this time are negotiating and eventually do sign the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Behind the scenes, Mrs. Nixon is working it again with her secret sauce of diplomacy, working with the wives of the Soviet premier and the Soviet diplomats to talk about how they want peace for their children and their grandchildren, and how can they facilitate this, pushing their husbands to sign the treaty. And it does happen. And it is still so rare that Mrs. Nixon gets any credit for the strategic diplomacy she practices behind the scenes so skillfully. Now, moving on, here you see Pat with her two beautiful daughters. So Julie Eisenhower, well, at this time, still Julie Nixon on the left, and then Tricia Nixon Cox later is her married name on the right. If pressed, I am quite sure Mrs. Nixon would say her greatest legacy was not anything she did as second lady or first lady, but it was her two children, her daughters, Julie and Tricia. However, I believe these two daughters form part of the impetus for what I think is Mrs. Nixon's second most impactful legacy, not in that order, I would say on par with her diplomacy, and that is her push both behind the scenes and publicly for women's rights. Now, just to define where she was coming from, she was not a feminist in the second wave sense, but remember that Western pioneer upbringing. The women have to do it all. They can do it all. She believed a qualified woman could do anything, could be president, could be a diplomat, lawyer, doctor, whatever, panda keeper, whatever you want. This person could do that. She was very pro-women. And the ways that she shows this, the evidence that supports this is varied and very strong. First, she consistently supported the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which, by the way, began first on the Republican platform in 1940. The Democrats did not adopt that till later. It started on the Republican platform in 1940, and she supported it since the very, very beginning, as did her husband. She was the first incumbent first lady to support the ERA as well. She was also the first lady to use the word abortion publicly. That had never been said in public by a first lady. And she supported a woman's right to choose. She thought that should be an issue that a woman decided, perhaps with the help of her doctor. And she said this even before Roe versus Wade in 1973 gave women the constitutional right for an abortion. Of course, that's not around anymore. But at the time, Mrs. Nixon was very progressive and said that even before Roe versus Wade. Since her time as second lady, Mrs. Nixon said very pointedly that her job was to lift up women wherever she went on these foreign trips. And she would frequently visit Muslim countries where women were veiled, they were not seen in public, and she deliberately very specifically would make sure she was out and about in public, not with a veil, unless she absolutely had to be. She wanted to do that to model for other women. As she said on one of her trips, quote, "Everywhere I went, it helped women." Now, this was a wonderful hidden history that I uncovered. And this is why archives are super cool. And you should use the archives here all the time because they are like treasure chest, Christmas, all wrapped up into one. I have found several books here, actually, as some of you may know. So big plug for the archives. But I was digging in the archives at the Hoover Institute at Stanford and found this story related to Mrs. Nixon. Mrs. Nixon pushed very, very hard to get a qualified woman on the Supreme Court. And this is something I found, one thing I found in that archive is earlier than we had all thought before, as early as 1969, President Nixon had considered putting a woman on the Supreme Court. And one of the women he had in mind for this role was an African-American lawyer named Jewel LaFontaine. And you see Jewel right here in the slide. She was prominent in Republican politics at the time, and she acted as Nixon's civil rights advisor in the 1960 campaign. And in the photo, you see Ms. LaFontaine seconding Nixon's nomination at that 1960 GOP convention. So then we skip along in time. Nixon loses the 60 election and has this great comeback in 68. He wins. And in 1971, Mildred Lillies is the name you might remember that rises to the top as a Supreme Court, a woman candidate. Alas, American Bar Association, and I'm sorry if anyone is a lawyer here, I suspect there might be some, but the ABA at the time is very much of an old boys club, and they quash this nomination for Lilly, potential nomination leaks. The ABA quashes it. They don't want a woman of any color being a Supreme Court justice. And Mrs. Nixon says that, is furious about it, and pushes her husband to keep trying. In 1972, Jewel LaFontaine's name comes up again for the Supreme Court. I was able, while at Stanford, looking in the John Ehrlichman's papers that had just been unsealed, I found a 72 memo that said, list of Black women for the Supreme Court. Amazing. So I start jumping up and down and dancing around and being weird, and then a total nerd. And then I nerd out more and I go to the Nixon tapes and I match on the tapes the day of that memo. President Nixon is on the tape saying it needs to be a woman and a Black woman. This will solve two problems at once. Amazing. So I nerd out even more, call my editor, freak out. And also end up interviewing Jewel's son, who is around and runs the biggest minority-owned mutual fund in the country. So very successful family. Alas, though, despite all that cool nerdness, a female Supreme Court justice does not happen, as we know, until 1981 with Sandra Day O'Connor. And we don't get a woman of color until just 2022 with Ketanji Brown Jackson. But the long point of this is the seeds of gender and race equality on the court begin during the Nixon administration, in part thanks to Mrs. Nixon, who kept pushing her husband continuously to get this done. Now, Barbara Hackman Franklin, here's a much younger picture of Barbara here, who you saw in the blue suit in the video in the beginning. Barbara Hackman Franklin was a recent Harvard Business School grad, one of the first women to graduate from Harvard Business School, and a banker. And she was recruited by the Nixon administration to be staff assistant to the president in 1971. So what was her job? Her job was to recruit talented young women for mid to high level government jobs. Behind the scenes, as Barbara repeatedly told me in the interviews I did at her apartment at the Watergate, Mrs. Nixon, always behind the scenes, we've got to get women in government. What can we do? Pushing for this to happen quietly behind the scenes. Among those that Franklin would ID is Sandra Day O'Connor. That was one of the women she found through what she called her talent bank of talented women. So later, our first female Supreme Court justice. Franklin's efforts also ushered in the first female FBI agents, tugboat captains, forest rangers, and sky marshals. By the end of her tenure in 1973, the numbers of women in policymaking positions had tripled. And then by the end of her tenure, 1,000 additional women were promoted into mid-level federal jobs. And just to give you a little balance, under Kennedy, I think there were maybe a score, maybe 20 some women that were in these positions. Under Johnson, there were a couple hundred. And with Nixon, we're up in over 1,000. I mean, this is a quantum leap here, which you don't hear about very often, but much due and thanks to Mrs. Nixon, to Barbara Hackman Franklin, and to President Nixon himself. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures. And honestly, this is the picture I wanted for the cover of the book. It's such a great picture. This is the prize tonight, except I don't know that I have a prize. I might have to make up a prize. But I would love if people could identify the men in the picture. Who are these three handsome men of the GOP? Anybody yell out a name? Now I can't hear anything. You might have to raise your hand. Ronald Reagan, yes. Who else? Bob Dole, yes. And Jimmy Stewart, yay, Triple Crown. Excellent, excellent. I would throw out money, but I don't have, I don't make enough money to do that. But yes, you are correct. These are all men of the GOP. I worked with Senator Dole on my last book quite a bit, very fond of him. But this is Mrs. Nixon at the GOP convention, a photo of her here in Miami at this convention in August of 1972. She is the first lady to address a Republican nominating convention. And she's really at the apex of her popularity here. She's kind of relaxed into the role. She's very comfortable with it. And Gallup Poll had just named her the most admired woman in the world. If you watch a video of this event, and what's so great about all these things, scenes from the Nixon administration, you can find all of them on YouTube. If you go watch this, she gets 9 minutes of nonstop applause. And she gets kind of annoyed because people will not shut up and be quiet and let her talk. And she has a gavel that weighs as much as she does. And she keeps banging it. And everyone's like, we love Pat. We love Pat. And they won't stop. So she just patiently stands there and then finally gives her short speech. But it gives you the feel for how truly popular she was. A famous senator once said to Richard Nixon, Dick, you're controversial, but everybody loves Pat. And that is the case. And she retains this even long after they leave Washington. She would be on Gallup Poll's list of the 10 most admired women 14 times total. And this is even long after the Watergate affair that we will talk about next. Oh boy. Well, every book needs a good villain, right? In this case, there are multiple villains. So it was kind of interesting to find out who they were. And of course, support this with archival evidence and firsthand interviews. So these two are known as the Germans. So the Watergate affair, of course, to back up a little bit, this begins brewing right around the time of that convention, right after. So on June 17th, 1972, this is when the break-in occurs at the Democratic National Headquarters in DC at the famous Watergate complex. Two of President Nixon's closest aides, who you see here, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's chief domestic advisor on the left with the glasses, and H.R. Bob Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, who you see on the right, come to the forefront of media attention. They are also known in the popular press by a wonderful series of names, Hans and Franz, the Siamese twins, the Praetorian Guard, and my personal favorite, which is what I called them when I was writing, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. So the reason the media uses these names, particularly ones like Hans and Franz, is because of their Germanic names and their secretive militaristic style. So the Germans are accused of building a, quote, Berlin Wall around the president, isolating him from his family, his old friends, and his former, and some of the present staffers also. Mrs. Nixon's East Wing staff especially resented Haldeman for his sexist, controlling ways. Mrs. Nixon firmly puts down numerous attempts by Haldeman and Ehrlichman to take over the East Wing. They literally want to take over the East Wing, correspondence, other parts, and put it under the West Wing. And then they try to give Mrs. Nixon a male chief of staff. And she says to her husband, Dick, I will not have a male chief of staff. And that is the end of it. She has a female chief of staff. But unfortunately, the Pat and Dick team that I've told you about that was so powerful for so many years is minimized, is shoved aside, and he becomes more and more isolated and more sort of in the thrall of these guys. And Pat's counsel to the president is minimized. By the time that Watergate is in full force, she really knows little more about what's going on in Watergate than what she reads in the papers. Finally, in April of 1974, the Germans were fired by the president. The Nixon family and remaining loyal White House staff come together to fight what they called the last campaign. Unfortunately, the last campaign turns out to be a lost cause. So our final slide here is the Nixon resignation, which a few of you might have even watched this on television, and you still can on YouTube. So on August 8th, 1974, now just over 50 years ago, President Nixon resigned on national television. The next day, August 9th, Richard and Pat Nixon relinquished their roles as president and first lady to Vice President Gerald Ford and his wife, Betty, and they were old friends and political allies of the Nixons. Despite the total chaos surrounding Pat Nixon this whole time, and for really years, several years before with Watergate, Mrs. Nixon has the presence of mind to send out hand-signed cards to well-wishers throughout the last day, and also remembered to have 38 red roses awaiting the new 38th president and first lady when they arrived at the White House. That is a small detail, but it tells you so much about Pat Nixon. She was always thinking about other people, even in the midst of this horrible, stressful event. As President and Mrs. Nixon walked to the presidential helicopter together to fly to their California home, Casa Pacifica in San Clemente, Mrs. Nixon did not cry. She kept her dignity and composure to the last, and she only said on the helicopter, "It's sad. It's so sad." And then she said, when Nixon is pardoned later, she said, "A pardon for what?" So just to summarize, if it's even possible, to try to summarize Pat Nixon in just a couple of minutes, she was a truly remarkable and groundbreaking First Lady, leaving behind a multitude of important contributions to her office, all of which are detailed in my book. But today, I did try to focus primarily on what I think are her two most impactful legacies as First Lady. Again, these are her skillful practice of global international diplomacy and her private and public push for women's rights. While it's truly impossible to quickly sum up everything about Pat Nixon as a person, I think there are three traits from my years of study of her that I would say define her the best. First, I always go back to, where are you from? This defines you. So in her case, that Western frontier, that pioneer spirit, upbringing, and outlook on life. This also feeds into her dislike of hierarchy and the people, the Berlin Wall that surrounds her husband, very resentful of that. And she still maintains what she thinks during that time. Second, her incredible poise that allows her to keep calm and carry on, even in the most stressful of scenarios, like Watergate or back in time, the Checkers speech. And last, her refusal to quit in tough situations, even when the odds were against the Nixons. She remained loyal and steadfast, both to her husband and also to her core beliefs until the very end. So thank you so much for your attention. I would be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
I just have one about when you were doing your research, because I was very aware of politics in that era. And I mean, I even wore an ERA bracelet so long ago.
Yes.
But the thing was, and I was a political science major, so I was, attuned to stuff. But what I remember is the Vietnam War was like all over the papers. So you didn't see much about Pat Nixon. Did you discover that?
Oh, absolutely. For multiple reasons. So she was a wartime first lady. So, in wartime, things are kind of in crisis mode. But I will say about Vietnam, she is the first lady to go in a combat zone. And she goes to Vietnam. She visits the troops. She sits with wounded soldiers. And it is dangerous. I mean, she is in a danger zone. So that was incredibly courageous of her to do. Now, part of Pat Nixon not being seen is also she didn't like taking credit for things. And this was sometimes to her detriment because she didn't want to take credit. But also the Germans that I talked about, they were always tamping down her publicity because they thought it would, so they said it would hurt the popularity of the president, when in truth, it just would make him more popular. So, these guys, a lot of them are Madison Avenue people, and they get an F on PR because it just, obviously she was so popular. She should have been used more as more of an asset. So, but you're right, Vietnam was everywhere. Yes.
Did Mrs. Nixon ever meet Phyllis Schlafly? And do you comment on that in the book? And also, did she still believe in the ERA till the time she died?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Well, it's interesting you say that because my nephew, the political genius, wants me to do a book on Phyllis, which might be difficult for me because I am, love the ERA, and Mrs. Nixon did too. They did not meet, but there's an interesting thing I dug up again in the wonderful archives. This was at the Nixon archive. Phyllis Schlafly had begged Mrs. Nixon to come to a big gala event she was giving celebrating GOP women. And Pat had taken a big red pen and crossed it out and wrote "no" with exclamation points on it. So I take that. I'm taking a few liberties, but I'm taking that to mean she was not a fan of Phyllis Schlafly, who ruined the ERA. For those of you who don't know, go look that up. So yeah, but to my knowledge, they never did meet in person. And she did always support the ERA from 1940 till the day she died. She supported the ERA, even when the Republican Party didn't after 1980. Yes.
Hi. Did Mrs. Nixon ever publicly or privately with her husband interject her thoughts relative to what was going on relative to the Watergate scandal between Haldeman and the president, and between the president and Henry Kissinger relative to the policies and the tactics going on in Vietnam?
Oh, no, Mrs. Nixon never. She thought, as first lady, she never would advise on policy, definitely not publicly. Now, there's always, what do people say, which I hate the term, the pillow talk diplomacy, but that, she definitely would tell her husband in private what she thought about things. And in terms of Kissinger, no, I don't think there was ever anything there. But Haldeman, yes, when they tried to give her a male chief of staff, and that was Haldeman, that was one of the few times she said, Dick, I will not have a male chief of staff. No. And she pushed back a lot on Haldeman when he tried to take over the East Wing correspondence and a lot of the East Wing, and Ehrlichman was behind that too. She said, absolutely not. This is not happening. So she definitely tried to keep her sphere, the East Wing, her side of the house, under her control. But it was difficult because of the undermining going on in the West Wing. But in terms of policy, she was very careful never to say anything publicly, particularly about foreign policy. Now, she did speak publicly that she wanted and needed to have a woman on the Supreme Court. That was one of the big ones she went to bat over. So once in a rare while, she would make a policy statement, and then the abortion statement's the other one where she supported abortion rights for women. I mean, that was really something. So with her, it was more, you really listen, because she did not say make policy pronouncements hardly ever, and always on really domestic things. On Vietnam too, very little on record about that. So she was very, very worried because of, her past, about saying anything that might embarrass her husband or get him in trouble with the press. Other questions?
Hi, ma'am. You talked about Mrs. Eisenhower. I read somewhere where Mrs. Eisenhower had heart problems. Did you ever find anything like that? Because she didn't do very much in the White House.
Yes, she actually did have, I think there was a heart problem. She also had something called Meniere's disease, like an inner ear imbalance. And there were also rumors about Mrs. Eisenhower that she had a drinking problem, but that was her inner ear issue. So that gave her, sometimes she was a little unsteady. So yes, Mamie was sickly, and she often would retreat to her mother's home in Pennsylvania. And it was at Gettysburg, their farm they bought later in Pennsylvania. She would also go there. So I make a few jokes at Mamie's expense, because she was very much of an old school first lady, but she was sickly, and she did need to not be in the White House all the time due to that.
Yeah, what did Mrs. Nixon die of?
Oh, goodness. Well, Mrs. Nixon, as I said, smoked a lot. I think that was one of her sort of stress relievers. So complication, lung cancer and complications from that. And then her husband, Richard Nixon, dies only 9 months after Pat. I mean, another thing to watch is the funeral. There is sort of this conception that they had a loveless marriage, which I did not find at all. And again, looking at the sources, the two daughters gave me a lot of love letters that people had not seen before. And clearly it was a deep, loving relationship. But I think many strains put on it from politics, of course, particularly Watergate. But when she dies, if you go watch the funeral, he has a total breakdown, is in tears. So it's very poignant and sad. He really didn't last long without Mrs. Nixon. Yes.
What was her master's degree in, and also how active was she in the post-presidency?
Yes. Okay. So her master's degree, she did a lot. It wasn't, like today, like it had a different name, but it was really like a business economics, home economics type thing. She was also very interested in literacy and reading. That's something she did a lot of in the White House, I think, from her master's degree and college days. Now, in terms of the post-presidency, so Watergate happens. If you read the book, you'll see it was a nonstop, 40 years in politics. And when Watergate happens and they go into kind of a semi-exile in San Clemente, she does one other engagement. She dedicates the Pat Nixon Elementary School in Cerritos, California, and that is the end, other than dedicating the Nixon Library. And then she does attend the dedication of the Reagan Library. And she is like, I am 100% done with this. She deserves it. She gardens. She's like a master gardener. She loved roses. She is with her grandchildren. That was her favorite role, was being a grandmother. And the kids all loved her and made her play shoe store for like hours and hours and hours. I would have been like, goodbye, I'm leaving. But she is the most patient grandmother. And she loves to read. She loves biographies and historical fiction and just being with her family. So, it's nice. She finally has that sense of peace. And it's interesting with the relationship with her husband. It comes around to like the early days of the marriage where they're so smitten with each other. It comes around at the end after all this turmoil. They are so sweet with each other. And he particularly is very solicitous of her and like will bring her chocolate and roses and all these little gifts and never ask her. She never does another engagement with him again. She doesn't even do like dinners with him. He kind of has a political renaissance. He doesn't expect her to go and she doesn't go. She's done. So she earned it, I think.
And I think that's a perfect place for us to stop tonight.
Great.
So
Thank you.
copies of Heath's book will be